It was the second day of August back in 2008, when two lone souls stood trembling high upon that savage mountain. Before the sun would rise again, one of them would meet his maker, while the other would survive to spin a dark yarn. Two friends stood together at the very top of the world, but by the time night fell, one was gone and one remained. That lucky survivor told a tale the whole wide world believed for years, but it was nothing but a story that wasn't true. The truth tends to die a slow and painful death up at that altitude, but years later new ghosts whispered a darker reality. We have to ask if a hero truly died saving lives, or if a survivor just lied through his teeth about the blood. This right here is the haunted story of the K2 climber, who lied so. Welcome y'all to the deep and extreme edge. Marco Confortola liked to say, he was born right in the mountains of Valferva, Italy, where the thin air was his first breath. Raised up among the ancient glaciers, he watched his daddy guide folks and learned to read the deep snow, just like a book. By the time he was just a teenager, he was dead set on following his daddy's path and became a guide at 18. He earned that fancy guide badge quicker than most folks ever could, making him one of the youngest souls to ever wear it. Earning that silver badge meant surviving long and grueling days out in the Alps, practicing how to pull bodies from deep, dark cracks. Those poor candidates endured blinding blizzards and whiteouts, while forced to sleep out on exposed ridges like lost sheep, waiting for the slaughter. Many of them came back down with black frost-bitten fingers or failure, but Marco passed that test by the skin of his teeth. That narrow victory launched his legend, and by his 20s, he had joined the Alpine Rescue Service to chase death in the snow. These are the brave men who go up into the storm when everyone else is running down, facing that cold disaster head-on. Victory often meant nothing more than carrying a cold, broken body back intact, and Marco claimed 300 climbs of the Grand Z. Down in that quiet valley, no one dared to argue out loud, because he built his name on repetition and high-risky business. The Alps soon became too small for his hunger because the dark drama of high-altitude life called him to the jagged Himalayas. It was the early 2000s when the expeditions began, and in 2004, Marco announced his attempt to climb Everest. The climb started way out on the dusty Tibetan plateau, where the first big hurdle was that icy North Col rising high above. It was a wall of solid ice rising to 23,000 feet, where Marco hammered his sharp crampons into the blue frost. Climbing that 1,000-foot headwall meant risking everything, while exposed to the constant threat of ice collapsing right down on his poor head. He navigated that rocky spine past Camp 2, moving toward those infamous 3 steps that sit way up high at 27,000. At the second step, there is a vertical rock cliff, nearly 100 feet high, where that famous old Chinese ladder is fixed. Imagine dragging your dying body up a vertical ladder where the jets fly while you are starved of the very air you need. After clearing the third step and that final ridge traverse, Marco stood all alone on top, at 29,032. The real danger ain't the climb up, but the time spent rotting in the death zone, because coming down is harder than dying. Hypoxia set in deep, but Marco returned home, a hero, claiming he had done the deed without a single tank of sweet oxygen. Some experts whispered their doubts about his claim because he looked far too fresh for a man who had walked with the Reaper. Marco joined Silvio Mondinelli on Annapurna, where he spun a dark yarn about an epic climb through falling rocks and pure bone-deep weariness. But the cold notes whisper a different truth, saying, Marco stopped short at a 4 summit while Silvio pushed on into the white mist alone. Marco let the details blur, like a ghost in the fog, and by 2008, he was haunting K2 base camp. His twisted fate was about to tangle up tight with a man named Gerald McDonnell, a smart Irish engineer living way out in Alaska. He was a 27-year-old soul who moved across the water to the frozen north, looking for work during the boom times. The wild peaks of Alaska called his name, and over 5 long years the city man became a rugged and bearded mountain climber. His wild, thick beard and his deep kindness earned him the nickname Jesus among the lost peers who saw the light in his eyes. He joined an Irish team on Everest in 2003, but he struggled deeply with the biting cold and the thin air. Despite the pain gnawing at his bones, Gur became the beating heart of the team, telling stories and singing to keep the ghosts away. On May 26th, he stood on the summit, not for his own ego, but with a heart full of thanks for the Sherpas. While other folks were busy celebrating their own personal victories, Gurr was celebrating the teamwork and a deep respect for that old mountain spirit. Everest surely confirmed he had the guts for it, but it inevitably raised another much more dangerous question for his wandering soul to answer. Back in 2006, he climbed Broad Peak, reaching the top first, but that was just a cold warm-up for K2. Why would a man risk his hide for K2? Well, for Gurr it was the ultimate test where one dies for every 4 summits. Climbers have to deal with unpredictable weather and the constant danger from falling chunks of ice and rock that want to crush your bones. He was way up high, breathing that thin air, when something terrible happened, and a large rock broke right off the dark mountain face. It did not just crush his helmet, it smashed directly into his skull, leaving him instantly stranded at extreme altitude, with a cracked open head. Gare needed a hospital within an hour, or he was going to die while Mick and Banjo watched the whole tragic scene play out. A risky helicopter evacuation saved his life, and he healed up physically, but the dark psychological impact remained buried deep in his troubled mind. Instead of breaking him, that bloody accident just motivated him, and he could not wait to head back to K2 with his demons. Several international teams gathered on the mountain, including Dutch and Korean folks, and they all agreed to cooperate on fixing those lifeline ropes. During the long waiting periods, Marco and Gare met and became friends, finding themselves roped together on that same path toward their doom. The summit push began on August 1st with dozens of people rushing out, until someone noticed the ropes were not fixed right at all. A deadly bottleneck formed, forcing climbers to wait while the precious daylight bled away and they looked like fireflies crawling up a dark hill. Gare climbed past the very spot where his blood had spilled years before, and you have to wonder if he felt the cold dread. Marco and Gare finally stood on the summit of K2 that Friday night, but the celebration was cut short by the encroaching dark. Their oxygen tanks were running on empty, and a threatening cold wind began to claw at their skin, telling them they had to leave. It was on their way down that things took a wicked turn, when a massive block of ice the size of a building collapsed. That ice fall swept away poor climbers, and most critically, it severed the fixed ropes that were the only lifeline for those folks above. They had no choice but to spend a long, freezing night above 28,000 feet, without any shelter, right there in the open. Marco dug 2 small holes in the snow, so he and Gare could camp for the night, hoping their limbs wouldn't freeze solid by dawn. The next morning, both men moved out of their holes, exhausted and frostbitten, but grateful they had survived the worst night of their lives. As they struggled to get down, they saw a tangle of ropes below where 3 men were trapped, like flies caught in a web. Some were hanging upside down with twisted limbs, and at least 2 of them were no longer moving in that cold and thin air. They were on a steep traverse, where a single slip would send a soul falling thousands of feet down the face of the bottleneck. For 3 hours they worked hard to free the men, but Marco realized the trapped climbers were beyond saving and he was afraid to die. Marco and Gare agreed they would descend together, but when Marco began moving down the slope, Gare didn't follow him into the gray mist. At first Marco assumed his friend was right behind him, but when he looked back, Gare was gone, somewhere near the bodies in the rope. Marco reached the lower part of the bottleneck alone with his oxygen gone and every step feeling like he was walking on sharp knives. He barely made it to Camp 4, where rescuers found him delirious, and when the reporters came, he gave them a story to believe. Marco claimed Gare stayed behind to save those poor souls, and that was the noble way he met his cold and lonely end. The newspapers ate it up, calling him the Irishman, who sacrificed himself, but other whispers began to rise up from the cold snow. Some climbers at the lower camps swore they saw Gare alive long after the time Marco claimed his friend was already dead and gone. Others insisted that Gare kept on helping those injured folks, even after Marco had turned his back and ran down for his life. That is where the story starts to fracture like bad ice, because Marco gave answers that shifted every time the wind changed direction. First he said Gare had fallen, and then he said he was frozen where he stood, like a statue made of ice and fear. In yet another telling, he claimed he never saw Gare again after the first collapse, leaving gaps wide enough to swallow the truth. But when the television cameras started rolling, Marco's version of the events began to harden into something cold that he could live with. He told the reporters he stayed behind for hours, trying to help, but the trapped climbers were surely beyond any human saving hand. He said it was something that just came from his heart, but later on he claimed he paid the consequences for that kindness. But that little camera Gur handed to Pemba Gyalje Sherpa before the summit told a different story than the one Marco was spinning. Those haunting photos eventually became the key evidence, suggesting it was Ger, and not Marco, who had remained behind to help the trapped. Even the official rescue logs conflicted mightily with what Marco described, making the whole situation smell purely wrong to those paying close attention. While he told the world Ger was already dead, satellite data and other testimonies suggested Ger was still alive for many hours longer. It seemed quite possible that Ger was still helping those poor injured souls, while Marco was busy making his own dark way down. You have to sit back and ask why Marco's story kept changing like the weather, and if it was trauma clouding his memory. Or maybe it was something more deliberate, an attempt to control the narrative before the cold hard truth finally caught up to him. It is surely not hard to imagine the pressure he faced being the only surviving professional guide left alive on that cursed mountain. Questions would naturally point toward him asking if he left his friend behind to save his own skin in the dead of night. Or did he truly believe in his heart that Ger was gone, lost to the ice before he turned his back on him? Those dark questions have never been fully answered, even in Con Moriarty's reflective piece, where the tone is careful and respectful of the dead. He wrote with respect for Ger's legacy, but he was keenly aware of how vague and contradictory Marco's statements were becoming over time. Moriarty never accuses him directly, but his inclusion of reports criticizing climbers for declaring folks dead too soon feels mighty pointed and sharp. What we know for sure is that Ger McDonnell was last seen alive near those fallen climbers, still trying his best to help. He was standing there moments before another massive serac collapsed and swept him away into the void while he was doing good work. His broken body was later found higher on the slope than expected, which is hard evidence that he had stayed behind to help. So the question remains, did Marco truly not know what happened to his friend, or did he choose silence over the unbearable truth? Perhaps in the chaos of K2, he descended to save his own breath, while Ger stayed behind to die for strangers' lives. Either way you look at it, only one of them made it down that mountain, and ever since that day, the story lingers. Marco's story has never fully matched the mountain's silence, and the ghosts of that day still whisper their secrets in the cold wind. Standing there beneath the trembling ice wall, he surely saw the darkness coming down like a heavy curtain, calling an end to his time. When folks started sticking pins in the map, the distance between the lie and the truth looked wider than the mouth of hell itself. Sitting alone with nothing but the clinking of ice in a glass, a man can see ghosts staring back from the bottom of whiskey. The headlines screamed about heroes and martyrs, but in the quiet of the night, the digital glow illuminated a fear that would not sleep. Time froze up there on the peak just like that battered watch, and no amount of tapping the glass could ever make it tick. Walking down the long, silent halls of memory, he stopped to look at the savage mountain that had taken his friend and his peace. Every step across the carpet was a painful reminder of the toes he left behind, frozen in the ice as a toll for living. That satellite phone call was nothing but static and wind carrying a desperate plea that would eventually get lost in the howling white void. Lighting a candle in the dark church might warm the hands, but it does mighty little to thaw the cold guilt in the soul. Looking at that old photograph of two smiling friends on the summit brings a bitterness that tastes just like ash in the back throat. Pacing back and forth under those buzzing lights feels like waiting for the executioner, while the applause bleeds through the thin studio walls. The blue glow of that X-ray showed the jagged truth where bone used to be, reminding him of the price paid. Standing in the quiet snow of the boneyard, he placed a flower down and wondered if the dead were judging him from below. The ink bled into the paper just like his memories did, blurring the lines between what really happened and what he wished had. Watching the cold rain streak down the glass felt like watching the tears of the mountain trying to wash away a dirty sin. Sorting through that old gear in the dim garage, he tossed aside the broken harness that smelled like fear and thin, cold air. Surrounded by kin at the dinner table, he felt a million miles away, drifting alone in the silence of the high death zone. Moving through the crowded airport, he kept his head down low, hoping the flashing screens wouldn't show the face of the yellow ghost. Holding that map up to the dying light, he traced the ridgeline, looking for a place where a man could hide forever. Staring down at the dark, swirling water below the bridge, he wondered if the silence down there was as heavy as the snow. Standing at that telescope, he saw a tiny speck moving high up where only ghosts or dying men should be walking that late. He traced the radio logs with a trembling finger and found the times didn't match the story he had been selling to the world. Standing on that steep slope, he watched the mountain shudder as a second massive wall of ice broke loose to swallow the living. Sitting under the hot studio lights, he crossed his arms tight and shook his head, denying the questions that hung heavy in the air. He pictured his friend frozen like a statue on the ridge, claiming the ice had taken him long before he turned to leave. He walked away into the thick gray mist and didn't look back, while the mountain swallowed the man who had stayed behind to help. Staring into the hotel mirror, he practiced the look of a grieving hero, trying to make the lie sit right on his face. He leaned into the microphone with open hands and spun a tale that sounded so sweet, while the truth rotted in the dark. Flashbulbs popped like lightning in the airport hall as he held up a hand to quiet the crowd, hungry for a tragic hero. He held up 3 fingers and then 4, trying to make the timeline fit a reality that just would not line up right. Drawing that red mark way higher up the slope than the first one, he realized the story he told was a purely wicked lie. Staring at that satellite photo, he traced a path going up instead of down, and the cold weight of it hit him like stone. Standing on that windy ridge, he looked back over his shoulder at the empty white slope where a friend should have been following him. Hiding his face in his hands by the dying fire, he tried to block out the sound of the wind, screaming his friend's name. Out in the freezing cold, the yellow figure knelt down to help a stranger, proving that some men have hearts bigger than the mountain. He looked up as the massive shadow of death swallowed the sun, and he stood tall, accepting his fate with a quiet mountain grace. Walking down that long, sterile hallway, he felt a coldness inside that no amount of medicine or doctors could ever hope to truly fix. Watching a bird take flight from the park bench, his mind drifted back to the thin air where souls fly free and bodies remain. He turned the key in the heavy metal lock, sealing away the papers and the guilt in a dark place where light never shines. Lying awake in the dead of night, he watched the fan blades spin round and round, just like the lies spinning in his head. Staring into that glass, he sees 2 faces looking back, and one of them belongs to a ghost that just won't let him be. He pressed that heavy brass stamp into the hot red wax, sealing up his secrets tight in a tomb where the dead can't speak. The wind howled like a banshee, tearing at his mind, while the snow swirled around him in a chaotic dance of pure white madness. He turned his boots down that steep, icy slope and walked away from the dying, leaving his honor frozen back there in the dark. But the man in the yellow suit just sat there, peaceful on the ledge, watching the storm roll in like he was welcoming a friend. Sitting in that chair, watching the city move below, he realized he was still trapped up on that peak, while the world kept turning. Seasons changed from gold to gray, but he remained a statue of grief, stuck in a winter that never seemed to find its spring. He tried to force those jagged pieces together, but the edges of his story just would not fit, no matter how hard he pushed. That mountain stands silent and cold, indifferent to the little lives it swallows whole, and the heavy secrets buried deep under the ancient ice. He turns to look you dead in the eye, asking a silent question that haunts the darkness between the beats of a guilty heart. He had a laugh that could warm a frozen tent, and folks called him Jesus because of that wild beard and his kind soul. Back on Everest, he fought the cold with trembling hands, but he never once let the mountain break his spirit or steal his smile. While the wind howled outside, he would sing old songs by the stove, keeping the creeping darkness at bay with nothing but a tune. On that high summit, he did not conquer the peak, but knelt down in gratitude, embracing the sky just before the long fall began. He packed his bags for K2 with a heavy heart, knowing deep down that destiny was waiting for him on the savage ice. When the others ran down, he turned his boots back up toward the death zone, choosing to save a life instead of his own. He reached out a hand in the blinding whiteout, offering hope to a dying stranger while the clock ran out on his own time. The mountain finally claimed him with a roar of white powder sweeping his good soul off the face of the earth into eternal silence. Now all that remains is a worn leather glove, held in trembling hands, while the silence of the empty room screams out his name. Looking out at the thunder and rain, he sees the reflection of a man who walked away when he truly should have stayed behind. Standing between those mirrors, he sees 1,000 different ghosts of himself, and not a single one of them knows the whole dark truth. The lies swirl around him like a storm of razor-sharp paper trying to cut him deep while he walks head down into darkness. High above the clouds, that man in yellow stands eternal, bathed in a golden light that the living can only ever dream of touching. One by one, those stage lights flicker and die, leaving the survivor all alone in the shadow of a story no one believes anymore. Standing at the edge of the world, he lets the dust slip through his fingers, watching it scatter into the void like lost souls. He places a hand over his beating heart, but he cannot tell if the rhythm he feels is the truth or just another lie. He walks away across the flat white snowfield, and the wind erases his footprints, as if he was never even there to begin with. In the end, there is only a single tear falling in the dark, and the silence of a mountain that keeps its wicked secrets forever.